Hey guys, welcome to the video. If you haven't seen my channel before, my name is Sky and I was a Chrysler service technician for over 10 years before last year I decided to move on and start doing my own thing. Now, if you're here because you're trying to just fix a cam and lifter issue on your own vehicle, keep watching the video. Now, primarily this video is a build series. We're gonna do some upgrades, but the repair process is basically identical. So if that's what you're interested in, I have it listed in the video description down below. I have the chapters where we can just skip forward into the actual repair process. Enjoy the video. Hey guys, welcome back once again to Reignited. Now, I know I always say I'm excited about new projects, but in this case, I am especially excited because you guessed it, we are finally working on our 2010 Dodge Challenger RT. So this series is all about 5.7 Hemi upgrades. Now, the great thing is this is all focusing on upgrades that you guys can do at home in your own garage, your own driveway with basic hand tools. Nothing I've done here is going to be too in-depth, and that includes the camshaft installation. Don't be too afraid, don't be thrown off by that. The Hemi engine is actually a fairly straightforward engine. I'm gonna break it down and show it to you step by step how you can do it with no issue. I'd also like to talk about what this series is going to be and what it's not going to be. Now, what it's not going to be is this pursuit of huge power numbers. That's not what I'm after here. What I'm after is basic bolt-ons that you guys are gonna be able to do yourself. So with that being said, the overview of the parts we're installing here, the first thing, the big thing that we're gonna be doing is installing this uprated camshaft. This is a 6.4 liter Hemi camshaft. Now, it is shown that the 6.4 camshaft can give you very modest gains throughout the rev range. And some of you might ask, well, if you're gonna be in there doing a camshaft anyway, why not go for one of the more uprated ones that'll give you more power on the top end? Well, there's a couple of reasons for that. And one of them, to be fair, is cost, because it's significantly cheaper to go with one of these camshafts. But that's not really the real reason why. The primary reason why I'm going with this camshaft over a higher rated one is because most of the higher rated camshafts require you to lock your VVT phaser in place, because the lift is such that you can't have that actuating. I don't want that. I want as much factory drivability as possible. So I still want my VVT to actuate as normal. 6.4 liter camshaft accomplishes that. So that's what we're going to be installing in the car. Along with that, because I'm going to have the cylinder heads off, I'm also going to be installing new lifters. The vehicle does have 120,000 miles on it. It's just a good thing to do while you're in there at that kind of mileage to replace these lifters. So that's being done. I have new spark plugs, new exhaust gaskets, new valve cover gaskets. I'm also going to be installing a Diablo Sport tuner on here. So this one is adjustable. I'm not sure how much adjustability we're gonna get out of it for as far as tuning goes, but it will be interesting to see how much power we can make at the end. Possibly, I would like to be able to dyno test this thing when it's all done, hopefully give you guys some final power numbers. We'll see if that's the case. Now, along with the intake side, we have a K&N cold air intake. Now, do I really expect to see any power from this K&N system? Not really, maybe a horsepower more. The factory intake system on these cars is fine. There's not a whole lot wrong with it, but this kind of fits with the look of the car. It's gonna uprate it just a little bit, and for whoever buys the vehicle next, it's just kind of one of those things that they wanna see on a performance vehicle. So it's getting a K&N intake on there. So that takes care of the intake side of the engine. Now we gotta get that air back out of the engine. Now the car already has a catback styled exhaust on there. However, I wanna upgrade it just a little bit more with these 6.1 liter SRT styled shorty headers. Now, these headers are factory Chrysler headers for the SRT models. I think they look great. I think they flow decent, well enough, definitely better than the factory cast manifolds do. So these are gonna go on. I'm gonna have to modify the mid pipes a little bit to try to make things work in there. We'll see as we go along with that. Also, we're going to be doing a catch can system on there. I'm not huge on the catch can systems, but it seems like a big thing within the Mopar world that guys just want to put that catch can on there. They don't want that PCV vapors going through that intake manifold, gunking everything up. Honestly, I don't really see that there's a problem with it, but I'm interested to install this catch can system, run it for about 1,000 miles and see kind of what the results are, just how much oil is trapped up in this PCV catch can system. We're going to find that out. Now, the final thing we're going to put on here is, because we are going with an uprated camshaft, I am going to be installing Mopar Performance valve springs. So we're gonna go with some uprated valve springs on there as well. Again, all of this is going to be stuff that you guys can do at home. It's not too big of a deal. I will be using my lift in this video, but it's definitely something you guys can do at jack stands with no problem. So our first order of business here, we're gonna get started installing this camshaft. Let's get into it, guys. This car might be a 2010, but it is in really nice condition. And I had the added benefit of my brother-in-law running it over with a buffer to really clean it up, really bring that shine back out of it. But the red, obviously a nice touch. This car already has some lowering springs on it, so the stance is nice. Like I said, we're gonna change these wheels and tires out of here, get something better on there. You'll see that at the end. But let's get into this camshaft swap. First step here is not strictly necessary, but if you are going to be doing a lot of work to the vehicle, having a lot of things unplugged, it does make sense sometimes to have the battery disconnected. So we'll go ahead and pull the battery cable off of here. There we go. Isolate it for the duration of the repairs. Now the big thing about this is don't let your trunk fall back down because it is electrically opened on your trunk. So if you shut the trunk with the battery disconnected, you're gonna have to climb through the vehicle, fold down the back seats, and then reach through to actually pull the release to get it to open back up again. So the very first thing I like to do when I know I'm going to have the cylinder heads off of a Hemi engine, this is not a totally necessary step, but I really like to do it. I like to get this entire cowl panel out of the way, get this little strut bar kind of brace guy out of here, because even though you can do this whole job with all this installed, once you take this out, you have so much room off the back side of this to get to like the back of the intake manifold, any of the bell housing bolts if you need to do that, a lot of the wiring and heater hose setups there. Get this guy out of your way and it is so much easier to work back here. You have so much more room. It only takes a couple of minutes to get it out. All right, I've mentioned this before in one of my other videos as a tip on how to get your windshield wipers off. A lot of times they just, man, they're just really stuck on there. Oh man, how do I get this thing out of here? You're pulling on it, yanking on it. Nothing's getting this thing loose. There's an easy trick to this one. Takes just 1 second to do. What you do is you put pressure right here and push it down, and that'll actually break the seal here and it'll just lift right off. Exactly like that. So no matter how tight these things are on here, if you give them the right pressure, there we go. Easy removal of the wipers. Now the rest of this panel is just held on with a series of these Christmas tree style push pin clips. So we'll go ahead and unclip all of those. And then there are 2 quarter turn Phillips head deals here. You just stick a Phillips head in there, quarter turn at 90 degrees, and then this whole panel will lift up and out of the way. Okay, now the cover plate's out of the way, we're gonna remove this little strut brace guy here. It's held in with 2 13mm bolts on each side. And then on this side over here, one of these 13mm bolts is holding your bracket that goes to your PCM. So once you unbolt this, you just gotta have to lift it off and push it back a little bit. You'll get this guy out of here. Also, there is this wire clip attached to it. Go ahead and just use a pry tool, disconnect the wire harness from the bar itself. Also notice that on this side over here with the bar, there's a bracket that's welded to it that actually slides into the lower grommet for your windshield wiper washer unit, or sorry, your windshield wiper motor assembly. So when you go back in, just make sure that that slides back into that grommet because it does support the lower half of this assembly. All right, now if this is not the sort of work you do consistently, it is very, very important to keep track of where all your bolts are. I always recommend wherever you set them, put the factory hardware back in the spot where it goes. Just makes it a lot easier to figure out where everything went. All right, now with that out of the way, we have all sorts of this room back here to get to our coolant connections back here, any sort of wiring harness connections, so much more room. So I definitely think it's worth the extra 10 minutes or whatever it's gonna take you to remove all of that stuff. Okay, next up, we're gonna remove our intake system. There's just a single 10mm bolt here. You've got an 8mm clamp here and 1 electrical connection right here. Yep, just that difficult. All right, next on the list, we're going to remove the intake manifold. So you have your plugs for your injectors you need to remove. There is a plug on the back for the map sensor. There's also going to be, you've got your throttle body here. There's also going to be a vacuum hose generally attached to the back of the intake manifold. We remove that, so make sure you get that out of there. Get this guy out of here and then we'll move on to the next step. Okay, so what I'm gonna do now is I've got the thing up on the lift. Again, you guys can do this very same thing on jack stands, but I'm gonna take off these lower, basically under trays that they have. There's one here and one here. We need both of these off because we need better access to the front here because we're going to be dropping the radiator out of this thing to give us enough room to get the camshaft out. So that's our next step, get these under trays out of the way. So the primary under tray is held on with 4 10mm bolts. This under tray is held on with a bunch of these 7mm screws, and then it also has push pins here along the fender well area. Okay, now we've got those out of the way. Looks like this thing had a pretty serious impact with our front cross member. No wonder our alignment isn't quite correct on this thing. This thing took a bit of a beating, but generally you can still correct for that with enough alignment adjustment on there. We'll definitely have to go get this thing professionally aligned. I think we're gonna be fine because I've seen much worse before. But anyway, right now what we're going to do is we're gonna go ahead and drain all of our coolant out of here and get this thing, probably get the cooling fan out and the radiator out, and then we'll start with more engine disassembly. All right, so in order to drain the coolant on this thing, this is on the passenger side, a lower portion of the radiator. You have this little valve here, you just unscrew that. Don't pull it, don't unscrew it until it comes all the way out because then it makes a giant mess. Just unscrew it until it's pouring out of this little vent hose here. Now, after you get that flowing, I'm gonna go ahead and lower this thing down and remove the reservoir cap off of there, and that allows there to be no vacuum on the system so it will drain freely. Off. There we go. Yeah, you're right, that's pretty thin. Okay, so what we're gonna do now is we're gonna pull this upper radiator hose while that's draining, and then we're gonna get this cooling fan module out of the way. Now you can do this without removing any of these accessories here. It's thin enough that there's 2 bolts, there's 1 on each side here. The lower portion of the cooling fan actually just slides into place. So you have your main power plug here, those 2 bolts, and this whole cooling fan module will slide up and out of the way. We should be able to get it out of there with no issue. Just like that, cooling fan module comes right out. So because this is a manual transmission car, you'll notice that it does not have the MDS solenoids in here. It comes factory with the block off plugs installed. So you can see that the block is cast the exact same between the manual and automatic versions. All they do on the manuals is they install these block off plugs. Okay, now that we've got this thing drained, we're gonna actually remove this whole cross member piece here that actually holds the radiator up in place. So there's just 2 bolts on each side. This thing drops out of the way. Now the important thing to figure out now that we're going to do is once we actually get this radiator start to come out of here, the AC condenser is still attached to the front of the radiator. So we just need it to drop down far enough to where we can access the bolts that hold it to the front of the radiator. Once we unbolt the condenser, then the radiator itself will drop out of here, and then we should have enough room to remove the camshaft. Right. There we go. So you can see the radiator is actually dropping out now. Now we should have access to reach all of the, looks like 8mm bolts that hold the condenser assembly to the radiator. So it's just a matter of getting up in there and loosening up those bolts. Okay, so now that I'm back underneath the vehicle, what I'm going to do is I'm going to go ahead and basically unbolt the collectors from these mid pipes here. Now in this case, because I am changing it to an aftermarket style header, I'm actually going to remove these mid pipes entirely, but if you're just doing a camshaft, you absolutely do not need to remove these. All you need to do is unbolt them from the collector itself. All right. Now it's a good time also while you're under here to disconnect the O2 sensors that go to the manifolds themselves, because when you pull the cylinder heads, the manifolds will remain attached to the cylinder head. So you might be wondering, while we're doing all this other stuff underneath, why don't we drain the oil right now? Well, what I like to do, what I find that helps is I will wait to actually drain the oil until after I have the cylinder heads back on the vehicle. The reason for that is because when you pull the cylinder heads, all the coolant that's in those water passageways, it ends up filtering its way down into the crankcase. And yes, you could drain it after the fact, but what I find works really well is You just wait until you got the cylinder heads back on and the system is all sealed up. And then that coolant actually will find its way underneath the oil in the oil pan. And then when you drain it, the oil pressure on top of that coolant will really help force all of that coolant out of there. Now, is it really that big of a deal? I suspect it would probably drain the coolant just fine, but it's a technique that I use and I think it works well. All right, so now we got all that done, I think we're gonna focus on removing all of the accessories off the front of the engine so we can get the timing cover off of the engine. So that means we're gonna be taking the belt off, tensioner off of there. You do not need to remove the water pump from the timing cover itself. You can leave it attached. There are a couple of bolts that go all the way through into the block itself, so you have to remove those longer bolts, but there's no need to pull the water pump off, so you don't have to get a water pump gasket or anything like that. The less you can take apart, the better in this situation. We're gonna take off the alternator on there. We're gonna pull the crankshaft damper pulley on there, get rid of the power steering pump. And again, power steering pump, you just unbolt it and lay it out of the way, so that way you're not losing any of that fluid on there. So I think that's the direction we're gonna go now. We're gonna go ahead and get these coolant tubes out of here as well. I think that's it. We're gonna start on that, and then after that, we'll go for the cylinder heads. So when it comes to the air conditioning compressor on there, you don't actually have to remove it all the way. You definitely do not have to discharge the AC system. What you can do is just loosen the rear bolt that holds it to the block, and then you take out the front bolts that hold it to the timing cover, and then it just kind of lays out of the way. So again, you don't need to remove the AC compressor. You do not need to discharge your AC system at all. Next thing we're going to do is there's these two coolant tubes that are attached to the timing cover. What we're going to do is go ahead and pop this one on the driver's side out. The passenger side one is just a press fit into the back of the timing housing. So once you actually pull the housing forward, it'll slip out of there. On the driver's side over here, you can come over here and take a look at it. So it slips into the front of the water pump housing here. But again, it's just a slip fit. There's a 10 millimeter that holds it into place. You remove that 10 millimeter, just take a small pry bar, lever in there. There you go. Pops up out of there. There's a little O-ring there. You want to check that O-ring, make sure it's still okay. On the back side of the engine back here, there's going to be a 10 millimeter bolt on each side that hold these coolant tubes in place. Go ahead and remove both of those 10 millimeter bolts, and you'll swing these coolant tubes up and out of the way. You don't really need to disconnect them from here. You can if you want them out of the way completely, but for me, I just disconnect this bolt here and then lay them out of the way on each side. All right, so out of the whole job, this is the one thing that I would say you would probably need some sort of a special tool for, and that's pulling the crankshaft damper. The problem is, on all these Chryslers, they had a variety of different styles of dampers on there, so the pullers that you use to take them off are all a little bit different. In this case, you can see I was able to screw in these 3 bolts with this style of a puller and pull it right out. In other cases, you'll need kind of a modified 3-jaw style puller, but be advised that your normal 3-jaw pullers generally will not work on these sort of things. So what you need to do is, before you begin the job, you need to identify which type of damper you have and what sort of puller you need to take it off. Even if you have to purchase a puller for these things, most times you can get them off of Amazon for like $25, $35, somewhere around there. So not too big of an investment, and then you have it for the future. All right, there we go. Now we got all of our accessories off of our timing cover. Now we're gonna pull the timing cover itself. The thing to remember is that there are 5 10 millimeter bolts that go from the bottom side up into the timing cover that go from the oil pan. You need to remove those 5, and then there's a number of 13 millimeter bolts that hold the timing cover into the block itself. Now, some of these bolts do not go all the way through. You'll know as soon as you pull them out if they're a short or long one. If they're a short one, you can go ahead and just run them right back in because they belong to the water pump itself. And we don't, like I mentioned, we don't need to pull the water pump off. So let's get into it. Let's pull that timing cover off. All right, so now we've got all of our bolts out for our timing cover. We're gonna go ahead and just pry on it just a little bit to help pop it free. Now, I want you to think about this and realize that if you are prying on it and it's not coming free easily, you missed a bolt somewhere. Don't keep prying on it. So it shouldn't take much to really pop this thing loose. There we go. Timing cover gasket doesn't want to let go. There we go. All right. Timing cover is off. All right, now it's finally time. We've got that timing cover off there. Now we're gonna focus on the cylinder head. So we're gonna remove the coil packs. There is no designation for these things. There's no particular hole they belong in. You can just put them wherever you want, so not a big deal there. After we take the coil packs out, we'll take the rocker arms, we'll take the valve covers off, and then we'll take the rocker arm assemblies off. And there'll be a couple of little things I wanna mention when we do that. You can hear how sticky that factory valve cover gasket was. It's been on there for, I guess, 11 years now, so we are replacing them with new ones. There we go. Side. This one will come off though. Basically, what we're gonna do now is we're gonna go ahead and pull these rocker stands off of here. I have to say, after getting the valve covers off, I'm really, really happy. Everything looks great inside the engine. Looks like it's had regular oil changes, very well taken care of, so very happy about that. We're gonna pull these rocker stands off now. There's 5 bolts for each set. The intake side are marked with an I, so you can't actually screw them up between the intake and exhaust, but it's still good to lay them out. I usually just lay them right in the valve cover itself in the way they came out. That way you don't mix anything up. Same with the push rods. You're supposed to keep them in the correct cylinder that they came out of. Is it entirely unnecessary? I don't really know about that, but if it makes you feel better, go ahead and just lay out the push rods in the exact order they came out so they go back into the same cylinder. All right, so now we've got the rocker stands off there. We got all the push rods out. I went ahead and took out all of the cylinder head bolts. There are 10 of the primary cylinder head bolts, and there are also 5 of the small ones up on top there. Once you get all the cylinder head bolts out of there, you should have the cylinder head ready to go, free to pop off of there. So take a little pry bar, or a big pry bar in this case, give it a little pop. There you go. You know it's free. You can hear the coolant kind of running out of there. We'll let that drain for a moment, and then you can pull the whole entire cylinder head with the exhaust manifold up out of the engine bay and go set it on the bench. Sometimes the cylinder head likes to get stuck to the cylinder head gasket, so you'll kind of have to wrangle it out of there. There we go. Not the lightest thing in the world. There we go. A little tighter on this side, trying to wrangle it out of the plate. There we go. Definitely watch yourselves on these head gaskets too, because they are multi-layer steel, so they can be very, very sharp. Come on. There we go. All right, so what we're gonna do now, we got the cylinder heads off, we're gonna go ahead and pull our lifters out. If you have an engine that has the MDS solenoids in there, this is definitely a step you'll wanna take. Pull these lifters out, check the condition of the roller needles on there. Likely, if you're tearing it down to this point, you're putting new lifters in anyway. That would be my recommendation, but let's take these ones out. Being a manual transmission, I really don't think we're gonna find anything wrong with them, but pays to check anyway. All right, so if you'll notice, all these lifters in this pack are non-MDS lifters. The MDS ones you can easily tell because they have these little metal pins on each side that depress and allow the lifter to collapse. So these are all solid. I'm definitely not seeing anything here that concerns me. I'm pulling up and down slightly on the actual roller lifter, and I'm not feeling any play at all. So technically these lifters are still good, but of course with this kind of mileage, we're just gonna replace them anyway. So our next step that we have here is go ahead and reinstall your crankshaft bolt here right in the end so you can actually spin the engine over using a wrench. And what we're looking for here is we want to time the engine before we remove the camshaft. Now, it's not super critical to do that because you can do it afterwards, but I think it makes way more sense to do it before. So what we're looking for here is on the camshaft sprocket itself, there's a vertical line. Now that vertical line needs to be marked up dead center with the top of the block here. So you'll see it come around, and in fact, our number 1 piston here will be at top dead center. So once this thing starts coming back up, we should be able to see our mark. All right, so here comes the piston. Right there. Now, if you come here and see on the actual sprocket itself, there's a vertical mark. You can't really tell. There you go. There's a vertical mark embossed into the crankshaft sprocket itself. And that when that is at 12 o'clock, that shows you that the engine is in time. Okay, so the next thing here is we want to go ahead and pin the tensioner for the timing chain into place. Right here, there is a little hole that if you press it back in, this thing just has spring tension on it essentially. So you just press in on this side here, and then you put a pin in of some sort. In my case, I'm going to use this little Allen key here as a pin in this tensioner to hold the tensioner in place. Okay, so now that the tensioner is pinned in place, you can remove these two 10mm bolts and remove the tensioner from the vehicle entirely. Do yourself a big favor here and don't drop these 10mm bolts down into the oil pan. All right, there's the tensioner there. You can see it's pinned in place, and just set this aside for later use. Last step before we pull our camshaft out, we'll want to break free the bolt that holds the camshaft sprocket in place. Now, if you're doing this without any sort of an impact tool of any kind, you want to break that bolt loose before you remove the tension on the timing chain, otherwise the thing's just going to spin on you. Now what you can do is just take this whole entire assembly and just lean it over to the side. You don't even have to take it out of the timing chain, just lean it out of the way. We need to remove the camshaft thrust plate. It's held in by these 4 bolts here. I believe it's a T30, so a Torx 30. And pop this plate off, and then the camshaft will just slide right on out of there. Now to get the camshaft out of here, best way to do it is to take the actual camshaft sprocket bolt, stick it back in there, thread it in a few turns. That just gives you a little bit of leverage, something to hold on to as you pull it out. There we go. I'll go ahead and remove the bolt now to give myself a little bit more room. Get the condenser out of the way here. There we go. Camshaft is out. So we got the camshaft out, we got the lifters out, and we are ready to start with our upgrades. I hope you guys join me for episode 2 when we start reassembling it. But I want to hear from you guys right now. Is there something that you learned from this video that you did not know previously? That's something I really enjoy. I enjoy teaching. I enjoy bringing this information to you guys because I want to show that, especially with this cam swap on here, it's not as difficult as you may think it is on the surface. So I hope you guys did learn something. And again, I hope you join me for episode 2. We'll see you next time on Reignited.